Okay, so in this video, I wanted to cover a common question I get from a lot of my non-resident clients, and it's, do you need an Itin to open a U.S. company? So an Itin is a U.S. tax ID number. It's an individual taxpayer identification number. If you're a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, you likely have a social security number, so an SSN. And very often, a lot of people think you need one of these tax ID numbers as an owner to open a U.S. company. And that is not the case, right? So what we're going to look at here is a U.S. LLC as an example, what you need, what you don't need, and who are the relevant parties when you form the entity. The initial question here, can the U.S. LLC be formed by non-U.S. persons? Yes, absolutely. So creating a U.S. company in the United States is relatively easy. You go to Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada, Florida. There's no restrictions on who can form the entity or who can own the entity. You can have U.S. persons, non-U.S. persons. You can have a mix of both. Really doesn't matter. The organizer of the LLC is going to be the person that actually files the documents with the state to form the entity. And then the LLC members are the owners, right? And then you could potentially have LLC managers, which are maybe not an owner in the company, but they're appointed as a manager to run the affairs of the entity on behalf of the LLC members. Now, the organizer and the LLC member can be the same person, right? So if you file these forms by yourself, you'll be the organizer, you'll be the LLC member manager, that's fine. But oftentimes the organizer might be a separate person. It could be a lawyer or a third party that's filing these documents on behalf of the owners. But under any circumstance, you don't need any U.S. persons in this mixture here, right? The organizer could be non-U.S., the members can be non-U.S., doesn't matter. So you don't need anybody with a U.S. Social Security number or an Itin to create the LLC, and then you also don't need a U.S. person to apply for the EIN for the entity, right? The EIN is the tax ID number that's assigned to the entity, and this is important because you need an EIN to file tax returns, and you definitely need an EIN to open a U.S. bank account. They're going to ask for that information. So if you're a non-U.S. person and you're going to open an LLC, what do you need to file? Well, you have to file articles of organization with the state where you want to form the entity, right? So if you go to Delaware, you'll file articles of organization, or some states use the language certificate of formation, whatever is appropriate given the state you're looking at. You also have to pay for a registered agent service within the state. So if you're a non-resident, you need to appoint a local registered agent for service of process, and that's usually about $50 a year. There's a lot of companies that provide that service, so you just kind of shop around a bit and find one that works for you. And then you should always have an LLC operating agreement. This isn't filed anywhere. It's kept internally, so you don't send this to the IRS. You don't have to send this to any state authority. Delaware, for example, wouldn't ask for this. But it's good because the LLC operating agreement dictates kind of how the organization is going to be run. And it's really, really important if you have more than one owner in an LLC, but it's still recommended for even single-member LLCs. And a lot of that comes down to asset protection reasons. So it's beyond the scope of this video, but single-member LLCs can have well-drafted operating agreements which provide for more liability protections than if the entity did not have an operating agreement. So I always recommend an LLC operating agreement, well drafted, not a boilerplate one. A lot of those don't work, but you should always have one for your LLC. After the LLC is formed, you apply for an EIN with the IRS, right? So when the LLC is owned by a non-resident, and the non-resident is the responsible party for the entity, you have to paper file or fax the form SS4 to the IRS. You can't apply for it online unless you have an Itin or an SSN. So yeah, again, just to reiterate, you don't need an Itin or SSN to file this form, right? You can fill it out as a non-resident for your LLC, paper file it or fax it to the IRS, and then they will reply back and assign your EIN to your LLC. And then lastly here, for non-residents, there's there's a relevant BE form. So BE 13 form is filed with the federal government, an agency of the government, and what this has done is it's designed to report anytime you have foreign direct investment in the U.S., and it's got to be filed within 45 days of formation. Now, most companies are able to file the B13 exemption form. Effectively, if your company is small enough, so it's a very new entity with no capital in it, you can file an exemption form, but you still have to file it. If you don't meet the exemptions, there's a litany of other types of BE forms that might have to be filed, but this is often overlooked. The BE 13 form is often overlooked. I don't know why. I mean, it's pretty clear in the regulations you have to file it, but a lot of practitioners fail to file this for their LLCs when they have non-resident owners. And it's important to file it because there's penalties for not doing it. So very important to file this. And then, of course, I don't have it listed here because it's kind of an obvious one, but at the end of the year, so not necessarily when the entity was formed, but every calendar year, every tax year, you need to be filing tax returns, right? Every U.S. company has got to file some type of tax return with the federal government. If it's a corporate entity, 1120, partnership, 1065. If you have an LLC that's owned by a single person that's foreign, so a foreign-owned disregarded entity, you're filing the Form 5472. Very, very important to file that because if you don't do it, it's a $25,000 penalty, right? So make sure you do it. Okay, so that covers it for this slide. Yeah, again, just to recapture the high-level points here, Itin's not required to open a U.S. company. You don't need one. It might make it easier to get a EIN or a bank account, but if you're a non-resident without any kind of U.S. tax ID number, you can still open a U.S. company. Just make sure you file all these or follow all these required steps, and then you should be okay. And of course, I always recommend reaching out to a experienced lawyer that deals with these entity formations, and particularly those that are formed by non-U.S. persons, because it can get a little more complicated. So that covers it. Thank you for watching. Always appreciate a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, and I look forward to seeing you again at the next video. Thank you.